debate to actually progress, two things need to happen. Firstly, we need to understand contextually what exactly it means to surrender in the context of war. And secondly, what we have to understand is what exactly are the primary incentives of Ukraine as a nation. We tell you this later on in my contextual reframe, which is very important. What is our stance here? What do we clash on, and what do we want to prove in today's debate? There's two levels to our clash. Firstly, that principally it's an invalid choice that Proposition Bench proposes, given the volatile circumstance surrounding identity, sovereignty, and economic standings in the context of the debate. And secondly, that we fulfill the primary incentives of Ukraine. In terms of our case, but I'll look more so at choice and identity and the validity of that choice, and then my speaker two will look more so at the economic implications because he's an eco-good. In terms of a contextual reframe, who exactly are we dealing with in today's debate? Who are our actors? What are their incentives? Why should we care? I'll catch you in a minute. In terms of our actors, note yet again, this is a actor motion. We ought to prioritize the incentives of Ukraine as the motion entails. What are the primary incentives of Ukraine? We see two levels. Firstly, it's the preservation of identity. It looks like language, culture, religion, economic and societal ideologies. We notice, given the history of Ukraine, that is one of the most valuable things that they value in their society. They value their identity. That is what they essentially motivated them to gain their independence from Russia. Secondly, what we see is they want to enable some sort of societal liberation. It looks like enabling democracy, equality, economic liberation, and societal liberation. We tell you, panel, that on both sides, both metrics for the debate, being those incentives, we achieve those better than Proposition Bench. Note, by technicality, this is very, very important because Proposition didn't really address this. By technicality, Ukraine has the upper hand in the war. They are essentially beating Russia. Okay, there's a few more things that I want you to note. Secondly, the very reason Ukraine established an independent state in the first place was for two reasons. Firstly, because they value their Ukrainian identity in terms of language, culture, etc. But secondly, the genuine impact on Ukrainian people. So it looks like Holodomor genocide, like the genuine impact of Russia on the Ukrainian people. It looks like Holodomor essentially genociding the Ukrainian people with man-made famine when they had control of Ukraine. It looks like them creating limitations on freedom to choose. It looks like imposition on the LGBTQ communities within these nations. Note, in terms of rebuttal, there's a few things. Firstly, they impose this burden on us. We tell you, literally, no, that's not our job. We don't want to prove that. We tell you that given the context of today's debate, our clash is more relevant, and hence that's why we choose it. Then they tell us in terms of the greater good of the people. We have three responses. They tell us how they aim to enable the greater good of Europe, etc. We tell you three responses. Firstly, given the context and what the entire motion is on about, we don't have to prove that that's not the most vulnerable actor. It has no relevance in today's debate. But then two other things. Firstly, we tell you it's not true. It looks like the appeasement laws that my speaker two will bring up, and I'll address a bit later on. And then thirdly, even if Russia has more power and political influence, Russia does not have more power in terms of military strength, etc. Okay. Thirdly, note the contradiction from Proposition Bench. They tell us that Russia is so powerful, they love showing off their nuclear power. But in the same breath, they tell us that they don't have the strength to use it on other Eastern European nations. We tell you that implicit in this contradiction, strategically it has no relevance in the debate, and strategically it does not actually help their case. On to the next thing, they tell us about how life is significantly better for the average person when you aren't scared for your life. We tell you two things. Firstly, the issue of systemic imposition still exists on their side of the house. We see impositions on the LGBT community. We see cultural impositions on the Ukrainian people because of their innate identities and their value for their identity as Ukrainian people and not as Russian people who subscribe to oppressive regimes. They value those things. But then, secondly, we tell you that our metric is most valuable because of the things that we justified, given the context and historical nature of today's debate. Fifthly, they tell us that Russia is not going to wipe out Ukraine, but then also the contradiction. In the same breath, they tell us that Ukrainian people are scared for their lives. So notice the contradiction here strategically. Also, they aren't reinforcing their case with that. Strategically, what do we see this in terms of their argumentation for legitimacy of their case? Strategically, what we see is because of the fact that they have not actually rationalized and analyzed the fact that it is a legitimate decision in terms of fulfilling the incentives of our actors, given the context that we have proven to be better than their side, ultimately it has no relevance in the debate. Onto my argumentation in terms of the preservation of identity being in the bounds of making a rational decision. The premise here is that by surrendering to Russia, we will see an imposition on identity. Before I get onto how that is the case, go for it.
Do you value the supposed preservation of their culture over their actual lives?
Oh, absolutely. Because when you're dealing with a choice, ultimately we can draw parallel to something like, if I'm pointing a gun to Zonru's head and I say sign this contract, is he actually acting in his best interest, or ultimately is it just an imposition on his life? We see that the issue still exists on their side. Strategically, it has no relevance. Okay, so how is it that by surrendering to Russia, we'll see an imposition on identity? Ukraine, in its independence, exists because of its will to be separate from Russia. It looks like the language laws of 2004, which advocated for Ukrainian language to combat the tyrannical imposition of Russia on the cultural front. Ukraine, just like every country ever, values its identity. We see, given the incentives of today's debate and the most vulnerable actor, that is the most primary incentive of our actor. We achieve that, we value that more than their side of the house. It also looks like them rejecting the oppressive ideological laws and impositions of Russian governance in efforts to preserve democracy, equality, culture, etc. We see this just simply with the governmental nature of Russia and it being an autocracy and an oppressive regime. We see, like I said, with the LGBTQ communities. How is it that by surrendering to Russia, they will forfeit their identity? Note that surrendering, by definition, in order to engage in their context, means forfeiting absolutely everything that entails your ideology, your identity, and also your governmental systems. We think it looks like ideologies, cultures, values, governmental systems. Why? Because Russia completely contrasts their ideals. Ultimately, by forfeiting to them, they have to surrender those ideals and they have to give up their identity. They have to give up all their values. We see this being an issue because you're imposing on their will to live and ultimately their choice to live. We value choice, we value autonomy compared to their side, which has the same issue of imposition on rights, simply in just another degree in terms of cultural imposition. And also we see systemic impositions like police enforcement. The impacts here, by not surrendering, we see the preservation of identity in terms of, firstly, geopolitical stances. Ultimately, Ukraine keeps their identity and how they want to run things and how they want to relate to other nations. Secondly, it looks like their cultural preservations. They get to remain as Ukrainian citizens and be separate from the tyrannical Russian nature that they often reject. We see this being important because that's the primary incentive of them. Thirdly, what we tell you is economic liberation, which my speaker will address in his speech. We believe that by enabling a society that is equality and democratically driven, that is ultimately the society that acts in the best interest of Ukraine. Why? Because of the nature of their country and ultimately because of their ties to other nations. We see this being